At my sister's wedding, my name wasn't on the program. My mother poured red wine down my dress in front of everyone. I said nothing. But by the time the vows began, the FBI walked in. They didn't come for me. They came for the groom. While the room froze, I stayed seated. While they screamed, I stayed still. I wasn't the girl in the spotlight. I was the one they tried to erase, and the only one who knew exactly what would happen next. The envelope was ivory thick and expensive. My name was written in gold cursive across the front, but I recognized my sister's handwriting immediately. Caroline always had a flair for dramatics, even in stationery. I stood in the small kitchen of my Cambridge apartment, my fingers already stained with ink from the morning's case files, and stared at the invitation like it might burn through the counter. Inside, there was a double-fold card, embossed with silver vines, and a photo of Caroline and her fiancé, Ethan Briggs, smiling in that polished, catalog-perfect way. The text read, "Together with their families, Caroline Monroe and Ethan Briggs invite you to celebrate their marriage." The venue was the Charles View Grand, Boston's most photographed hotel, and the date was 2 weeks from Saturday. I wasn't listed as a bridesmaid, not a maid of honor, not even a reader or someone assigned to hand out programs. There was a line on the RSVP card that said, "Seat reserved for Elise Monroe, guest of bride," with a little checkbox next to row 9. Row 9. Caroline had aunts who would sit closer than me. I poured myself a cup of coffee, still wearing my blazer from work, and sat on the edge of the couch. The window across the room framed a view of the neighbor's fire escape and a sky half obscured by brick. The city was humming outside. Inside, it was quiet. Caroline and I hadn't spoken in almost 4 months. The last time I saw her, she'd come into my office unannounced with Ethan wanting help interpreting some contracts tied to his firm's new investment fund. I remember her brushing off my explanations and Ethan barely glancing at me. They had left with a laugh, and I had gone back to redlining a lease agreement for a family whose landlord was illegally withholding repairs. She had always been the golden child. 3 years older, blonde, poised, always knowing what to say. She got into Cornell with average grades and average ambition, but our mother Meredith had spun it like she'd cracked the Ivy League on charm alone. My own acceptance to law school with a scholarship barely made it into the family group chat. Caroline went into PR. Meredith said it suited her. I went into litigation support. Meredith said I should have aimed for something more visible, something people could recognize at dinner parties. Being invisible was easier than fighting. I'd learned that young. I turned the invitation over in my hands. It smelled faintly of the perfume our mother used to wear when she hosted her fundraising galas, the kind of scent that lingered long after the room emptied. I looked at my phone on the counter, then picked it up. Her number was still saved as Mom in my contacts, though I hadn't called her since last Thanksgiving. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was brisk and unbothered. "Elise, I was wondering when you'd get around to calling. Did you receive the invitation?" "Yes, it came today." "Lovely," she said. "We wanted it to feel formal." Caroline spent hours with the designer. I noticed. I paused. "I'm coming." There was a brief silence, then a sigh, just audible. "Of course. Your family." That wasn't exactly what she meant. I knew the tone. The one she used when I wore navy instead of pastels to Easter brunch, or when I questioned why Caroline's name was the only one on the annual family holiday card. I knew better than to ask why I wasn't included in the bridal party. The answer would be something like, "It's Caroline's day," or "She just wanted to keep things simple." Still, I said it. I saw I'm seated in the back. Row 9. Meredith didn't miss a beat. "The front rows are for immediate family and the bridal party. You'll still have a lovely view. Don't make this about positioning Elise." This isn't court. It wasn't court. But it was still a trial. "Understood," I said. "Just..." Her tone softened, but only slightly. "Try not to bring attention to yourself. This weekend is about Caroline. She's under a lot of pressure. It's a big moment." I almost laughed. She always found a way to make my existence a potential liability. "I'll be quiet," I said. "Like always." "Good," she replied. Then her voice shifted, as if she'd already moved on to her next call or appointment. We'll see you Friday for the rehearsal dinner. Don't forget to RSVP formally. I hung up and set the phone down slowly, then poured the rest of my coffee down the sink. That night I pulled out the only dress I owned that could pass for black tie. It was clean simple, something I'd worn to court once during a bench trial. I held it against the mirror and tried to imagine myself standing next to Caroline in her custom Vera Wang. I looked like someone attending a funeral, not a wedding. Maybe that was fitting. My hands were still shaking slightly as I folded the invitation back into its envelope. I slid it under the stack of client files on my desk, where it could stay out of sight. Out of mind would take longer. The doorman barely glanced at me as I stepped out of the Uber. Maybe it was the dress. Maybe it was my face. I didn't look like someone who belonged at the Charlesview Grand on a Saturday afternoon in early May. The hotel stood tall against the pale blue sky, its glass windows gleaming like sharpened blades. I paused under the awning, tugging my blazer tighter over my navy sheath dress. It was clean and pressed, but I knew it wasn't the kind of dress that would land on the bride's Instagram story. Inside, everything smelled like orchids and polished marble. Soft music played from hidden speakers, and staff glided across the lobby with earpieces and clipboards. My heels clicked louder than I wanted them to as I crossed to the reception table. "Name, please," the young woman asked without looking up. "Elise Monroe." Her fingers hesitated briefly on the iPad. Then she nodded and handed me a program and a small white envelope with a table number inside. "You're in the garden ballroom. Ceremony starts in 15 minutes. Follow the gold carpet." I followed the line of guests, most of them already chatting in small clusters. Laughter floated around me like I was underwater. My reflection caught in the mirrored elevator panels as I passed. Tight jaw eyes, too tired hair pulled back in a way that said, functional, not festive. I didn't stop walking. The garden ballroom was every bit the spectacle I expected. Rows of white chairs alternating floral arrangements in pale blue and cream, and a silk canopy at the front draped with peonies. The lighting was soft and warm, designed to make people glow on camera. Strings played some classical arrangement I couldn't place. Maybe it was Bach. Maybe it was something written just for this moment. It didn't matter. I walked toward my assigned row, scanning the name cards on the aisle seats. Caroline and Ethan's parents were already seated at the front, perfectly arranged backs, straight faces, already smiling. The bridesmaids stood off to the side in floor-length satin, all in soft blush tones. I spotted Caroline near the entrance to the terrace, radiant in white, flanked by two stylists, adjusting the veil that floated behind her like smoke. No one looked my way. Row 9 was toward the back, 2 rows in front of the catering prep station, and 1 row behind a large potted plant that reeked faintly of fertilizer. My seat was marked Monroe Elise in slanted gold ink. I sat down, smoothing my dress, crossing my ankles. My bag sat in my lap. I held it like armor. Guests filled in around me. I caught snippets of conversation. "She got that dress in Paris. Ethan's father flew in from Zurich. Did you see the custom cocktails? They're named after the couple." I stared straight ahead. I couldn't see Caroline's face anymore, just her silhouette framed by sunlight and money. The music shifted. A hush fell over the room. Ushers moved into place. I watched as the processional began, bridesmaids gliding down the aisle, followed by a ring bearer in a navy suit, too small for his ears. The guests oohed and sighed on cue. Then Caroline stepped forward. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her gown hugged her in all the right places, the lace delicate but somehow commanding. Ethan stood waiting at the altar, all charm and jawline in a perfectly tailored tux. His eyes lit up when he saw her. Or maybe they just knew when to sparkle. People around me whispered how perfect they looked, how successful, how lucky. When I leaned slightly to the side, I caught a glimpse of my mother sitting in the front row. Meredith wore a steel-gray dress and Pearl's hair in an immaculate chignon, hands folded in her lap like she was holding a secret. Her expression was unreadable, proud, composed, triumphant. My father sat beside her. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. He still wore the same style of sport coat he always did, the kind that never quite fit in at formal events. He leaned over and murmured something to her. She didn't respond. After the vows, the music swelled again and the crowd erupted into applause. I clapped because it was expected. I stood when everyone else did. I smiled for the photos I wasn't in. The reception was held in the adjoining ballroom. Chandeliers like upside-down gardens hung from the ceiling, and every table was decorated with elaborate centerpieces and gold-plated flatware. I found my seat at table 15, tucked behind one of the larger floral installations. My name card sat beside two empty chairs marked "Guests of the Groom." They never showed. I poured myself a glass of water and watched as waiters circled with trays of signature cocktails. From across the room, Caroline was surrounded by guests, laughing with practiced ease. Ethan stood beside her, a hand on her lower back, occasionally leaning in to whisper something into her ear. They moved like a single machine. Meredith approached our table briefly, said hello to someone behind me, then noticed me. "Elise," she said, voice light and clipped. "I almost didn't see you. How lovely that you made it." "Hi, Mom." She looked me over once, then smiled again. Caroline wanted everything perfect. I think she managed. "Don't you?" The room was too loud for me to answer. I nodded. She moved on before I could say anything more. Later, during the father of the bride's toast, my dad took the microphone. He cleared his throat, spoke about Caroline's childhood, her determination, her leadership, even as a girl. He said she always knew what she wanted, and now she had it. When he finished, the room applauded. Caroline wiped away a tear. Ethan kissed her hand. I picked up my fork, pushed the food around my plate, and tried to swallow the tightness in my throat. My name hadn't been mentioned. Not once. At some point, I stood and walked to the back of the room near the refreshment table. A waiter nodded at me, then turned away. The crowd buzzed louder behind me. Someone started dancing. Flashbulbs from a photographer went off in quick succession. Everything felt choreographed. I was the only piece out of sync. I checked my phone, then slid it back into my bag without reading the messages. There was no one to text, no one to explain this to. I walked back to table 15 and sat down. The music picked up tempo, the dance floor filled. My water glass was still half full. My father passed by my table on the way to the bar, and I looked up. "Hi, Dad." He paused, blinked like he hadn't realized I was there. Then he smiled politely. "What are you doing these days again?" I hesitated. "Still at the firm in Cambridge," I said. "Legal support." "Ah." He nodded slowly. "That's good. That's real good." Then he kept walking. I watched him go, then leaned back in my chair and let the noise wash over me. The chandeliers sparkled, the champagne flowed, my seat wobbled slightly on the carpet. Nobody noticed. A waiter passed with a tray of Merlot. I took one mostly to keep my hands busy. The rim of the glass was cool, the wine deep and dark like velvet. Around me, the room pulsed with movement and chatter. Caroline and Ethan had taken to the dance floor now. Her train tucked expertly, their rhythm so effortless it looked rehearsed. Maybe it had been. I stood and made my way toward the back, not sure where I was going but needing to move. The ballroom spilled into a side corridor that led toward the restrooms and private lounges. It was quieter there, just the faint echo of jazz and footsteps in heels against marble tile. At the far end of the hallway was a small lounge with low lights and a long mirror. I stepped inside the door, swinging closed behind me with a soft click. I needed a minute, a breath, a place where I didn't have to smile or nod or pretend I wasn't invisible. I took another sip of wine and stared at my reflection. My dress clung a little too tightly under the arms. My makeup had settled into the lines under my eyes. I didn't look like anyone in this family, not in color or shape or posture. It was like I had wandered into someone else's story and forgotten to leave. The door creaked open behind me. Meredith walked in, heels precise against the floor, a crystal flute of champagne in one hand. "There you are," she said, like I had gone missing. I nodded once and turned back toward the mirror. She came to stand beside me, adjusted a bangle on her wrist. "I hope you're enjoying yourself. Caroline was worried you might feel out of place." I kept my gaze on the mirror. "I'm fine." She sipped from her glass, her eyes meeting mine in the reflection. "You've always had trouble with crowds." I set my wine down on the vanity. She turned toward me fully, then voice lowering. "I know this weekend has been a lot for you, Elise. Being the sister of the bride can be a complicated position. People don't always know where to place you." I braced myself for the rest. It came right on cue, but it's important that we all do our part to keep the tone of the evening joyful. No surprises, no distractions, just celebration. I said nothing. She lifted her glass slightly. "To family." I didn't move. She smiled. "Suit yourself." And then, with no warning, she tilted her wrist and let the contents of her champagne flute spill across my chest. The liquid soaked through the navy fabric, instantly cold and sticky and acidic. I gasped and stepped back, hands instinctively clutching at the stain. "Oh dear," she said too brightly, already turning toward the door. "That must have slipped. You should get that cleaned up before photos start again. It would be a shame to leave a mark." She walked out without another word. For a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there staring down at the spreading stain, the sweet smell of the wine rising up in waves. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I just breathed in once, then grabbed my purse and left the lounge. The restroom was empty. I locked myself in the farthest stall, peeled off the top half of my dress, and dabbed at the fabric with cold water and rough brown paper towels. The stain blurred and spread. The dress would never look right again. I stepped out, bare shoulders covered in goosebumps, and stood at the sink. The mirror was too honest. I looked humiliated, exactly the way she wanted. I opened my clutch to look for lip balm and paused. My phone wasn't inside. Panic flickered. I scanned the counter, checked the floor. Nothing. I retraced my steps mentally, then remembered setting it down in the bridal suite earlier when I was fixing my earring. I slipped out of the restroom and down the hallway again, passing through a service corridor. The door to the bridal suite was slightly ajar. Voices and music filtered through the crack. I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty now, chairs pulled out at odd angles, makeup brushes scattered across the vanity. The veil still hung from a garment rack near the window, ghostly and still. My phone was there near the perfume bottle where I'd left it. As I reached for it, I caught sight of another phone just beside it. Newer, gold case. The lock screen glowed with an unread email alert. It was Caroline's. I shouldn't have looked, I know that. But my hand moved before my conscience caught up. The screen lit up fully as I brushed it. Subject line: disbursement approved. Phase 3 initiated. I hesitated, then opened the email. It was a thread. Messages going back months. Ethan was the sender. The recipients were obscure, some private domains, some masked by aliases. The content was short but unmistakable. Numbers, transfers, routing information, notes like funnel complete and cleared 130K to EFG shell. Attached were PDFs, spreadsheets with donation figures, invoices marked community development, and a list of nonprofits I had only heard of in connection with embezzlement cases. I scanned down the file and saw her name. Caroline Monroe, listed as PR consultant. Under it, 2 transfers totaling $75,000. I grabbed my own phone, snapped photos of the screen, then backed out of the email quickly. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. I locked the phone, set it back exactly where it had been, and took mine. Then I walked out of the suite without looking back. My hands were cold. My dress was still damp. My mind was moving too fast for my feet to keep up. In the hallway, a waiter passed by with a fresh tray of red wine. I let him pass. I didn't need another drink. I had something better now. I just didn't know what to do with it yet. The ballroom felt colder when I returned, or maybe I was. I slid back into my seat at table 15, heart still thudding in my ears, the images I had just captured flickering like a slideshow behind my eyes. The spreadsheets, the fake charities, Ethan's name next to dollar signs, and Caroline's tucked beneath a neat title that screamed plausible deniability. Across the room, Caroline stood with Ethan near the dessert bar, laughing with someone from the finance world. I could tell by the cuffs. I watched her tuck her hair behind her ear, smile with practiced ease, then lean into Ethan like she'd done it 1,000 times. Maybe she had. I stood and crossed the room slowly. My feet felt detached from the floor like I was moving through a layer of water no one else could feel. I waited until Caroline noticed me. She glanced up, her expression barely shifting. "Hey, Elise?" She didn't smile. Just that tight line of pleasant surprise that people use when they're already calculating how fast they can escape. "Hey," I kept my voice light. "Can I borrow you for a second?" She hesitated, but Ethan gave her arm a little nudge. "Go ahead, babe. I'll grab you a refill." She followed me toward a quieter corner by the French doors. Outside, the Charles River glimmered, the city soft in the distance. Inside, her eyes sharpened. "What's this about?" I gestured toward the terrace. "I was just curious," I said, tilting my head like I didn't already know. "What's that nonprofit you've been working with, the one Ethan mentioned in his speech, Faith Hands?" She blinked. Just once. Her face didn't move otherwise. "Why?" I shrugged. It sounded familiar. "And I thought maybe we crossed paths professionally. I've been involved in a few tenant defense cases recently with misappropriated funds." That name came up. Maybe it's coincidence. Her arms crossed slowly, the diamond bracelet on her wrist, catching the chandelier light. "That's not your world, Elise, isn't it?" She leaned in slightly, her perfume, too sweet, her voice lower. "Look, I don't know what you think you heard or saw, but this is a very complicated arena. A lot of moving parts. You've always been smart, but you don't know how this stuff works." I looked her straight in the eye. "Try me." She laughed. Not loud, just a single exhale, like I had told a joke in poor taste. "You think you're going to, what, dig into my finances? Make some kind of moral stand? You couldn't even get Mom to sit through your law school graduation speech without checking her phone." And just like that, the temperature dropped. Her smile sharpened. "I know you, Elise. I know you like feeling right. But this is above you. And poking around in other people's business just because you're bored or bitter doesn't look good on you." I could feel my pulse in my jaw. I opened my mouth to respond, but the interruption came from behind. Meredith's heels clicked before her voice did. "Girls." Her tone was smooth measured. She slid between us like a knife. "What's going on?" "Just catching up," Caroline said quickly, her face softening into daughter mode. Meredith turned to me. Her eyes scanned my face like a scanner for disappointment. "Elise, I think it's best you wrap up early tonight. You've been quiet, distant, and I understand weddings can stir things up, but this isn't the time or the place." I didn't answer. Meredith reached out, touched my shoulder lightly, more like a symbolic gesture than comfort. "You've made your appearance. Let's leave it at that. Caroline has enough to focus on without drama. We all do." I looked at Caroline one last time. Her gaze didn't falter. It wasn't cold. It was worse than that. It was blank. I walked away without another word. Back in my room, I peeled off the wine-stained dress and wrapped myself in a hotel robe. The city lights glowed beyond the window, but I couldn't feel them. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my phone, and pulled up the photos again. I stared at Caroline's name, at Ethan's email signature, at the bank trails that looked too polished to be mistakes. Then I scrolled down and found Tyler's contact. We hadn't spoken in almost a year. Not since we agreed our careers and timelines didn't match. But his number was still saved, and my fingers knew it like muscle memory. I hit call before I could think too hard. He picked up on the third ring. "Elise." "Hey. Sorry. I know it's late. Is everything okay?" I hesitated. Then I sent the first 3 screenshots. "You should see this." Silence. Then a quiet buzz as his phone received the files. I waited. I could hear papers rustling on his end, maybe a keyboard tapping. Finally, he spoke. "Where did you get this?" "At my sister's wedding." "Long story." He was quiet again, then softer. "Elise, do you know what you just touched?" I looked at the screen one more time, at the names, the numbers, the nonprofit that wasn't. "I think I'm starting to." I lay back against the cold sheets, the light from the city flickering across the ceiling, and let the silence press into my ribs. I hadn't planned on any of this. I came because I thought maybe I could endure it. Maybe I could sit through the rehearsed vows and designer florals and leave without feeling like I was still 12 years old in the wrong dress at the wrong table. But Caroline never made room for people like me. Meredith never did either. I closed my eyes and remembered a graduation years ago. Mine. I had just been awarded a full scholarship to Northeastern Law. Not partial, not need-based, full ride. The kind of thing people framed letters about. When I told them over dinner, my father nodded once and said that was solid. Meredith barely looked up from her glass. That same week, Caroline walked across the stage at NYU's journalism school in a white dress, and the entire family flew out, took photos in front of the fountain, and threw her a rooftop celebration in Soho. Meredith told me not to take it personally. You always make everything heavier than it needs to be, Elise. Let your sister have her moment. That phrase had become a refrain. Let your sister have her moment. As if there were only ever going to be one, and I was always the one stealing light just by existing. I opened my laptop and created a new email address. No name, no signature, no way to trace it back. I wrote 3 lines: potential financial crimes involving Covenant Holdings and Faith Hands Foundation. Attached preliminary evidence. Involves Caroline Monroe and Ethan Briggs. More available. I attached the screenshots. Redacted identifying markers. Hit send. The recipient was the Boston field office. Public tip email. I knew the odds. I'd worked with prosecutors before. I knew that 90% of tips sat in limbo, that even good ones often died in inboxes. Still, when the automated reply hit my inbox 12 seconds later, my chest tightened. Your information has been received and is pending internal review. Please allow time for verification. No further response may be provided. I stared at the screen, then read it again. It didn't say thank you. It didn't say urgent. It didn't say anything. I sat still for a long time, the laptop humming softly beside me. All of a sudden, what I had felt like nothing again. I closed the computer, set it on the desk, and crossed to the window. The wedding had ended hours ago. The ballroom lights were dim. A few hotel staff lingered below, collecting stray glassware. Somewhere in the city, Caroline was probably in a honeymoon suite, sipping something expensive, her name newly printed on fresh stationery. I thought I might cry. But I didn't. Instead, I opened my phone, scrolled through texts I hadn't read. At the bottom was a message from a number not saved in my contacts. Hi, Elise. It's Kayla. Sorry to bother. I know you probably don't want to talk right now, but I saw what happened earlier. With your mom. With everything. If you ever need someone to confirm what went down, I'm here. Seriously, people saw. Not everyone agrees with how they treat you. I read it 3 times. My fingers hovered for a moment. Then I replied. Thank you. That means more than you know. She wrote back a minute later. I mean it. If you ever need a witness, I'll sign whatever. Take care of yourself tonight. I set the phone down and exhaled. It wasn't much. But maybe it was enough to start. The morning was sharp with sun. Boston in May had that kind of light that felt clean and unfiltered, like the city hadn't decided yet if it was forgiving or cruel. I wore a gray sheath dress, modest neckline, long sleeves. The zipper stuck briefly at my waist, and for a moment I considered not fixing it. But then I did. The Uber dropped me 2 blocks from the Charlesview Grand. I asked the driver to stop early. Something about walking the last stretch made me feel like I still had some control over what happened next. Outside the hotel, valet staff swarmed around guests in pastel dresses and rented tuxes. Camera crews set up under branded umbrellas, capturing polished arrivals. I approached the glass doors with my bag in one hand and the invitation in the other. I had folded it carefully so the embossed edge wouldn't crease. A woman in a headset intercepted me before I made it past the first velvet rope. Name, Elise Monroe. She typed something into a tablet, her brow furrowed. Sorry. I don't see you on the guest list. I held out the envelope. The QR code shimmered under the glass. This is an official invitation. Mailed, verified. You can scan it. She looked at it like it was a fake ID. One moment. She stepped away, speaking into her mic, already motioning to security. People around us were watching. A man behind me adjusted his cufflinks and glanced down at my shoes. Another couple whispered to each other and turned their backs slightly, like I might be contagious. Kayla appeared before they could say anything else. Elise. Her voice cut through the noise like a string snapping. She stepped between me and the headset girl heels, striking the pavement without hesitation. She's on the list. I confirmed her myself yesterday. Printed invitation overrides digital errors. I'll escort her in personally. She didn't wait for permission, just placed her hand lightly on my elbow and led me inside, nodding once at the confused attendant. Sorry about that, she said once we were past the threshold. I triple-checked everything, but I think someone on the Monroe side of the planning team made some last-minute edits to the list. Unapproved ones. I didn't ask who. I already knew. Kayla walked with me down the corridor toward the East Wing ballroom. The florals were already in place. Hydrangeas and calla lilies lined the hallway. It smelled expensive. Stage-managed. Perfect. She stopped just before the doors. You'll be seated with extended family. Table 17. It's near the back, but you'll have a clear view of the aisle. I made sure of it. Thanks. Her voice dropped slightly. I meant what I said last night. If anything escalates, I'm here. I've seen enough. I nodded, then stepped through the door. The ceremony space was white and lavender, like someone had plucked it from a bridal magazine. Rows of chairs tied with ribbon. Petals down the aisle. Soft harp music playing from a tucked-away corner. I found table 17 easily. It was near the edge of the aisle just before the catering partition. A low floral arrangement sat at the end of the row. Lavender white roses, a few pale blue anemones. I sat beside an older woman I didn't recognize and nodded politely. The USB in my purse felt heavier than it was. Compact, smooth. Like a secret you weren't supposed to carry, but couldn't let go of. Tyler had spent most of last night helping me organize it. We pulled the data, indexed the screenshots, zipped the contracts, and formatted the metadata trails. He made sure the documentation looked professional, readable, and prosecutable. He insisted we remove all my identifying marks from the email headers. Then he sent the whole thing to a contact he trusted. Her name was Reva Chen. Special Agent Financial Crimes Division, Boston Field Office. At 2:18 a.m., she responded. I reviewed the files. This warrants formal attention. I've opened a case and assigned it an internal track. Please do not discuss the matter with anyone outside federal counsel. We'll be in touch. I had read that message 6 times between sunrise and now. The seat to my left remained empty. To my right, someone coughed gently and leaned back. Caroline hadn't appeared yet. Meredith was already seated up front, second row, head held perfectly still, the same posture she always wore to charity events and public luncheons. Her hair was up, her face unreadable. Ethan stood near the arch, flanked by groomsmen. He looked rested, delighted, the kind of man who believed in his own myth. The music shifted. The bridal party began to walk. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers tracing the edge of the USB through the fabric of my purse. It was there. Everything I needed. Everything they couldn't control anymore. The doors opened. Caroline stepped into view. Lace silk veil like mist. The room exhaled all at once. I didn't. I just watched. Each step she took felt louder than the last, and I stayed seated, still, invisible. But not irrelevant, not anymore. The officiant smiled as the music faded, his voice gentle and steady as he welcomed everyone to the celebration. A few guests leaned forward in their seats, clutching programs wrapped in silk ribbon. Someone behind me sniffled. I sat perfectly still. Ethan took Caroline's hand and turned toward the crowd. His cufflinks caught the light silver against the deep navy of his suit. He looked every bit the man he had curated himself to be. Polished, trustworthy, unshakable. Thank you all for being here, he said, his voice clear and warm. I know it means the world to Caroline and me to have you witness this moment. A moment built not just on love, but on trust. He looked down at her, gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze. She beamed up at him like the world had never failed her. He turned back to the crowd. I vow to give Caroline a life of transparency, of honesty, a life grounded in integrity, faith, and clarity. He paused for effect. I will build with her not just a home, but a legacy she can be proud of. Someone clapped softly. Another guest wiped away a tear. I watched Ethan's mouth move and thought about the spreadsheets, the PDF attachments, the offshore wires disguised as grants to community gardens that did not exist. I thought about the email where he referred to a donor base as pliable and Caroline's name as a PR shield for plausible coverage. And I thought about the small red light on the back wall, the security feed that looped through the hotel's system and fed to an off-site server. The FBI would have that by now. The officiant nodded and adjusted his glasses. Beautifully said, Ethan. Now, Caroline. The doors opened behind us. Two men stepped into the room. They wore gray suits, not the kind tailored for social standing but for function, crisp federal badge-weighted. The younger one scanned the room with calm detachment. The older man, maybe late 50s, had a closely cropped beard and a voice that sliced the air without raising volume. Ethan Briggs, he said, projecting to the front. Please place your hands where I can see them. Gasps shot through the room. Chairs creaked. Caroline turned fully confused, one hand still holding her bouquet. Ethan froze. His lips parted like he might object, but no words came out. The agent continued. You are under arrest for violation of Title 18 United States Code, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, financial laundering, and misuse of nonprofit funds in excess of federal thresholds. Someone in the third row dropped their phone. The thud echoed. Ethan looked at Caroline, eyes wide now, voice low. This is a mistake. The older agent stepped forward, producing a folded document. We have a federal warrant issued this morning by the District Court of Massachusetts. You will be taken into custody and processed immediately. The officiant stepped back. Caroline turned pale. Her fingers loosened and the bouquet hit the floor. Ethan reached for her arm. Care, listen to me. This is political. It's optics. I can explain everything. She stepped away before he touched her. He turned back to the agents, palms up. My lawyer will fix this. You'll see. The younger agent approached with handcuffs. You're welcome to contact counsel from the holding facility. Turn around, sir. Ethan hesitated. For a moment I thought he might run, but there were already two more agents near the exit blocking the doors. He turned. The cuffs clicked like punctuation. Gasps turned to whispers. Caroline stood frozen, veil trembling slightly with the movement of her breath. Her mother had risen from the front row, hand half raised, but didn't move forward. No one did. The older agent turned toward the crowd. This ceremony is concluded. Please remain in your seats until hotel security gives clearance. Guests stared. No one moved. No one cried. I stayed seated. A woman to my right whispered, "Oh my God." Another muttered, "I told you that Charity was shady." Kayla appeared by the side door, expression tight, but not surprised. She began quietly instructing staff, ushering them toward exits. The older agent walked behind Ethan, reading him his rights. You have the right to remain silent. The words echoed like static against the crystal walls. You have the right to an attorney. Ethan didn't respond. His head was down now, shoulders tighter than before. He looked smaller. I didn't blink. I didn't turn away. Caroline finally looked up. Her eyes scanned the crowd, then settled for half a second in my direction. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just held her gaze. Then she looked away. They walked Ethan out through the main aisle, past friends, donors, extended family photographers, who no longer had the lenses lifted, and I sat still in row 9. Lavender to my left, USB in my purse, hands folded. For the first time in days, I didn't feel invisible. Gasps still hung in the air like static. One child began to cry quietly in the back, and someone's phone buzzed unanswered beneath a clutch. The heat from the overhead lights pressed down harder than before, but I didn't move. Across the aisle, Caroline still knelt on the floor in her wedding dress, a silk puddle of something no longer radiant. Her hands trembled as she tried to stand, clutching the edge of a chair for balance. Ethan was already gone, led out in cuffs by the two agents in gray. The shock hadn't worn off yet. It just calcified. Meredith's heels struck the tile like gunshots as she stormed forward, fury in full bloom. She cut between rows of frozen guests and raised her voice toward the remaining agents. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The older agent, the one with the close beard and eyes that didn't blink, often calmly pulled a second folder from inside his jacket. "Ma'am, this is a federal warrant authorizing seizure and review of records from Faith Hands Foundation. You're listed as an affiliated board advisor and appear in the expenditure logs of at least 3 related shell accounts." Her mouth twitched. "That's absurd. I was a public endorser, not an administrator. I never signed anything." The younger agent approached her. "We'd like to ask you a few questions. You're not under arrest at this time, but you will be required to remain on site." I could hear her inhale through clenched teeth. Caroline finally got to her feet, only to sway slightly. Her veil caught on the edge of a chair and tore. She didn't notice. Guests had begun moving now quietly, but purposefully. They tried to disappear in designer shoes and silk shawls, shielding themselves from proximity. No one offered to help. No one asked questions. They just collected their things and slid away like a tide rolling back. Kayla, calm but white-faced, coordinated with hotel security. I saw her quietly take hold of the venue manager's elbow and whisper something, pointing toward the exits. From the far end of the ballroom, Tyler entered. He didn't rush. His presence was deliberate, steady, a counterbalance to the chaos. He walked toward the agents and held out an envelope. "Additional documentation," he said. "Transactional records submitted this morning via secure channel. Confirmed metadata attached." The older agent flipped it open, glanced down, then gave a sharp nod. "Thank you. This will expedite processing." I watched Caroline turn to the Reverend as if needing something familiar, someone outside the bloodline. But Reverend Nolan was already being approached by another agent, a woman with her badge already raised. "Reverend, we need to ask about the list of donors you certified for Faith Hands Foundation. Many of the names appear to be fabricated." He blinked, lips parting. I assumed those came from the foundation. I was given a file by Ethan." "Did you verify the identity's number?" "That wasn't my responsibility." The agent raised an eyebrow. "But you did sign off on their legitimacy." He said nothing. The walls of ceremony were peeling, the polished surface crumbling. I stepped back closer to the table where I had been seated. The lavender centerpiece leaned sideways, one stem bent under its own weight. My purse sat where I left it, zipped, the USB still nestled inside. Not that it mattered anymore. Copies had already been sent. Backups secured. What I held now was just a reminder. Guests continued to stream out. Some glanced at me. None spoke. Meredith stood motionless as another agent read her rights. Her chin lifted, but her eyes darted. Caroline stood just a few feet away, arms limp at her sides. Her lipstick was smudged now, and her earrings had begun to slip. She looked at me finally, but there was no recognition. Just quiet horror. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. Behind me, Tyler joined me at the table. He said nothing, just rested a hand gently on the back of the empty chair beside me. "You okay?" he asked under his breath. I nodded. No one is ever okay after truth breaks loose. But sometimes silence holds longer than justice. Sometimes pain stretches so far it becomes invisible. They all thought I was the shadow in the corner, the +1, the background. But silence is not absence. I watched Meredith sign the temporary detainment form. I watched Caroline slump into a chair as staff poured a glass of water she wouldn't touch. I let my hand graze the edge of the table. No one defended me when Meredith poured wine on my chest. No one asked if I had somewhere to sit when they sent me to row 9. No one called me by name. Not until it was too late. Now they all had names. On paper. In evidence. In reports. And I had mine back. I stepped away slowly, past the wilted lavender, past the guests, who now looked without seeing toward the hall where my cab waited. Behind me the altar still stood. Empty. Untouched. Waiting for something that would never come. The cab smelled faintly of pine-scented cleaner and cheap vinyl. I sank into the seat without speaking, my body still humming with the residue of everything I had just watched collapse. Through the window, Boston's skyline flickered behind us, steady and indifferent. The driver didn't ask questions. He glanced once in the mirror and kept his eyes forward. By the time I got home, the silence felt different. Less empty, more earned. I turned off my phone and left it in the kitchen drawer. Whatever chaos was unfolding out there, it didn't need my participation. Not yet. Not tonight. But by morning, I didn't have a choice. Ethan's face was on the front page of the Boston Globe. The photo was grainy mid-motion, but there was no mistaking the man in the navy tux being led away in cuffs. Beneath it, the headline, "Groom arrested at altar in federal sting linked to charity fraud." I sat at my kitchen table with coffee gone cold, reading every word. The article stopped just short of naming Caroline, but the implications bled through. Her name trended on Twitter within hours. "Wedding of the decade ends in handcuffs," one post read. Another simply said, "Justice looks good in white." By noon, Channel 7 ran an exclusive interview with Meredith Monroe. Her hair was shellacked into perfect waves, pearls in place voice, trembling with a practiced outrage. She called me unstable, a bitter daughter who had always resented her sister's success, a troubled legal assistant who took a private family celebration and turned it into a spectacle. "She's always been difficult," Meredith said into the camera. "Jealous even as a child. Caroline had grace. Elise had complaints." I muted the TV. Across the room, the USB drive sat untouched where I had left it the night before. Its contents had already been duplicated, encrypted, forwarded. The originals were no longer necessary. The damage was done. Or maybe the repair had begun. Late that afternoon, I stepped into the lobby of the FBI Boston field office. Tyler had arranged the meeting. Not officially, not through work. But he had called in a favor from someone he trusted. Agent Reva Chen met me at the security gate with a clipboard and a badge clipped to her belt. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that reminded me of my best professors. She didn't smile, but she extended her hand firmly. "Elise Monroe." "Yes, follow me." Her office was utilitarian. No diplomas, no plants. Just files, a desk, and a monitor displaying what looked like a database interface. She gestured for me to sit. "We've processed the documents you submitted," she said. "They're valid, clean. Whoever helped you compile them knows what they're doing." I nodded once. "We've opened a case under Federal Code 1956 regarding laundering and wire fraud. There's also a public trust violation component that may expand the scope to co-conspirators." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She tapped her pen against a closed file. "I do have one question for the record," she said. "Why choose the wedding?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that directly. Not Meredith, not Caroline, not Tyler. Not even myself in the way that mattered. I looked her in the eye. Because that's the day they wrote me out of their lives. I just chose to respond in kind. Reva nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She closed the file and stood. "This may go to trial. You should prepare for that possibility, and for press attention. I'm not giving interviews. We figured as much. You're being referred to in the media as an anonymous whistleblower. They don't know your name yet. But they will. I don't care. Most people do. I'm not most people." She didn't argue. Just offered her hand again. "If anything changes, we'll contact you. Otherwise, stay available." I left the building and walked 2 blocks before I let myself breathe again. That night, the news reached national syndication. CNN ran the headline, "Boston Heiress Linked to Federal Fraud Probe." The footage showed Caroline being escorted to a black SUV, head down, flanked by lawyers. Meredith refused further comment. Ethan's bail was denied. The group chat with my former law school cohort lit up with theories. I didn't answer. I went to the corner market, bought oranges and rice, paid in cash, walked home in the rain. People still didn't recognize me on the street. At least not yet. The story hadn't named me. The photos hadn't shown my face. But whispers were starting. I heard one at a coffee shop the next morning. Two women leaning over a copy of the Post. Whoever leaked that stuff, one of them said they knew exactly what they were doing. The other nodded. That's not revenge. That's strategy. I stirred cream into my coffee and walked past them silent. They were right. I hadn't just wanted payback. I wanted clarity. And maybe now I finally had it. The stairs creaked louder than I remembered. Third floor walk-up, same peeling paint on the railing, same smell of someone cooking onions through too much oil. My key stuck in the lock for a second before it gave way. The air inside the apartment was still as if it had held its breath during everything that had happened. I dropped my bag on the kitchen chair and stood there for a moment. The light from the window had that muted gray hue that comes with late fall. Nothing urgent, nothing soft. I walked into the bedroom and knelt in front of the dresser's second drawer from the bottom. The wood stuck like always. I pulled it open with both hands, careful not to knock it off the rails. Tucked in the back, under a stack of old college t-shirts and receipts I hadn't thrown away, was the envelope. It was cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed but unglued over time. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Gloria Fields, my grandmother. Neat cursive in dark blue ink. She'd died 2 years ago. Stroke in her sleep. The letter had arrived a month before that. I hadn't opened it then. I wasn't ready to hear anything that sounded like a goodbye. But now I was ready for truth in every form. I sat on the floor, legs crossed, and peeled the flap open. Elise, you are not what they say about you when you leave the room. You are what you know about yourself when you're alone. Don't waste your breath trying to make people see you. Some people are blind on purpose. Love isn't always applause. Sometimes it's just someone standing behind you when the rest of the room walks away. You don't need to be their version of good to be good. You don't need their permission to matter. Don't wait for the apology. Know your worth without it. I'm proud of you. Always have been. Love, Gran. The words blurred for a second. I blinked and then read them again. Slower. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, an old paper, the kind that used to live in drawers full of scarves and costume jewelry. I folded the letter and placed it on my nightstand. I didn't cry then. Not yet. It wasn't until I turned my phone back on that it came. The notifications stacked fast. Voicemails, missed calls, news alerts, and one email. From Caroline Monroe, subject line, "Please." I hesitated. For a long moment I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Then I tapped. It was short. Elise, I know you hate me. Maybe you should. But please, I'm begging you, withdraw your statement. The press is killing Mom. Ethan's lawyers are turning on me. They say I knew more than I did. I didn't. If you help me get out of here, I'll tell the truth. All of it. I swear. You have the power to make this stop. Please. Caroline. I read it 3 times. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just leverage dressed as vulnerability. I closed the message, powered off my phone, set it face down next to Gran's letter, and I wept. Not out of sadness, not even release. It was something sharper. A knowing. It was the confirmation that the person I had once begged to see me could only ever see herself. And I didn't need that anymore. I didn't need to win her back. Or win at all. I just needed to keep walking. The cafe was too clean to feel warm. Sleek marble tables, chrome fixtures, quiet jazz looping over the sound system. I recognized it instantly as the kind of place Meredith picked not for comfort, but for optics. The kind of place where the light hit your cheekbones just right if you sat at the corner booth, where nothing messy could happen, at least on the surface. She was already there when I arrived. Alone, of course. Back straight, blazer crisp, a cup of something untouched in front of her. Her phone face down. Her purse, navy leather expensive, rested like armor beside her. She didn't rise to greet me. I slid into the booth across from her without speaking. She waited a beat, then pushed a manila folder across the table. Her fingers never touched mine. Let's speak plainly, she said. Inside the folder was a set of legal drafts, pre-trial negotiation language, petition to drop witness statement, accompanied by a motion for deferred prosecution, conditional pending character reference, and emotional impact testimony. For Caroline. I kept my hands on the folder but didn't open it. You want me to recant? I said. I want you to stop this from becoming a permanent stain, she replied. On your sister. On our family. On yourself. I exhaled once. Not a laugh. Not disbelief. Just exhaustion. And what do I get? Meredith tilted her chin slightly. Her tone cooled. Distance, privacy, maybe even a little redemption. You've made your point, Elise. No, I said quietly. I haven't. She blinked but didn't speak. I haven't made my point until someone finally admits what this has always been about. And it's not about Caroline's future. It's about the image you think you're still holding together. Her lips thinned. People are watching, she said. They've always been watching, I said. But now they're watching the real story, not the one you crafted on embossed stationery. She glanced around the cafe, then leaned forward slightly. Don't turn this into a personal vendetta. That's not what families do. I stared at her, slowly, deliberately. Families don't do a lot of things, Meredith. She flinched at the name. I had always called her Mom, but not today. I reached into the folder and pulled out one page. Read it, quietly. Emotional trauma. Public humiliation. Impact on Caroline's mental well-being, I murmured. No mention of the people Ethan defrauded. No mention of the fake nonprofit. No mention of you attending galas funded by stolen money. She didn't know everything she said too quickly. She knew enough to look the other way, I said. And so did you. Meredith's mouth opened, then closed. She smoothed her hand over the tablecloth that wasn't there. You're angry, she said finally. No, I said. I'm clear. She looked at me like she was trying to recognize someone she hadn't raised. Someone she never imagined would stand this still, this unmoved. You used to want my approval, she said. I used to need it, I corrected. Silence stretched. The waiter passed. Neither of us acknowledged him. Finally, I pushed the folder back across the table. I won't withdraw anything. I won't testify on her behalf. And if this goes to court, I'll sit there every day and look the jury in the eye. Meredith's face stiffened. Her hands clasped tightly. I don't care if you think I've betrayed you, I said, because I've finally stopped betraying myself. She opened her mouth again, but I stood. Tell Caroline, I added, that if she wants forgiveness, she can start by telling the truth, not by asking someone else to lie for her. I didn't wait for her to reply. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sidewalks were littered with amber leaves crushed under hurried feet. I walked toward the train station without checking to see if she watched me go. Behind me, inside the pristine cafe, Meredith stayed seated. Still, untouched. Exactly how she wanted the story to look, but no longer how it was. The train station smelled like burnt espresso and exhaust, the kind of mix that should have felt like an ending but didn't. I stood still for a second longer than necessary, then stepped forward without looking back. Whatever Meredith saw as she sat behind that cafe window was no longer my responsibility. Brooklyn came into view with a steady kind of rhythm. I found a walk-up apartment in Cobble Hill, nothing grand, but filled with light and quiet corners. I signed the lease without calling anyone. The landlord handed me one key and one look that said he didn't care who I was or where I came from. That suited me fine. I started with a folding chair and a second-hand desk. Then came the books, the kettle, the framed quote from Gran that I had written out myself. You don't need their permission to matter. It sat next to the window, where I sometimes watched the bakery below open at dawn. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I officially accepted a position with Holloway and Pierce, a firm known for taking on cases most others found too domestic, too complex, too quiet to care about. Survivors of coercion, financial abuse, families that use silence like a weapon. My first client was a woman who had not spoken to anyone outside her home in nearly 6 months. She smiled once when I told her she didn't owe anyone an explanation. The email from Agent Chen arrived mid-afternoon. A simple note. Ethan Briggs convicted. 12 years federal time. Parole eligibility in 9. Caroline Monroe plea deal accepted. 4 years suspended sentence. Lifetime ban from managing or consulting any financial institution. Required cooperation in ongoing investigations involving Faith Hands Foundation. I read the email twice, saved it, then moved it to a folder titled Closed. That evening I stood on my balcony, coffee in hand, watching the light shift over Manhattan's southern edge. The buildings across the river still looked like they had something to say, but I didn't need to listen. Glass towers don't remember who they ignore. I didn't post about the verdict. I didn't comment on the threads or respond to the messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. There was nothing left to explain, and I didn't need to make them understand. That was the most unexpected part of it all. Peace didn't arrive like a fanfare. It arrived like an empty inbox, like not checking the news. A week later, a small envelope came by post. No return address. I opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note. Elise, thank you for reminding me that silence is a choice. If you ever need a venue flipped last minute again, I'm still your girl. Kayla? I set it beside Gran's letter. They belonged next to each other. Two women who saw more than they said, but never less than what mattered. I sat at my desk that night, the same one with 3 scratches on the side I still hadn't covered. I opened a blank document, just to see it, to remind myself what space looked like. For a long time I thought power meant being seen. Then I thought it meant being believed. Now I know it means neither. It means choosing the ending even when they've already written you out of the beginning. They used to call me the odd one, the dramatic one, the one who overthought, overreacted, overreached. Now I'm the only one they can't predict, can't control, can't rewrite. I'm not the one they pushed out. I'm the one who walked out. And when you find yourself erased from the story you thought was yours, don't ask to be written back in. Pick up the pen and write the ending yourself.